Welcome to the Harry Bridges School of Labor, presented by Labor United Educational League. Our purpose is to educate the workers of America on the strength of unions and to foster a class-conscious workforce. We aim to connect the struggles of the past with the struggles of today to empower the labor movement to transform from their present hopeless defensive fight into an aggressive attack upon capital. We plan to empower workers with knowledge, regardless of industry or type of work, bring all workers to a class-oriented trade union movement. So tonight is going to be the history of the CIO Part 4, discussing the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. We'll learn about the early history of organizing in steel, the Great Steel Strike, and the need for industrial unionism, the organizing methods used in the steel industry, and the Steelworkers Organizing Committee organizing. So section 1 is the early history of organizing in steel. The Homestead strike of 1892. In the 1890s were a period of great labor struggles, exceeding in intensity and scope even those of the two previous decades. The working class, more and more employed in large enterprises, had grown very greatly in size. The arrogant capitalists resolved to strip their wage slaves of every trade union defense and to subject them to the most intense exploitation humanly possible. Met with extreme violence, all resistance on the part of the workers to their imperious will. But they encountered a working class rapidly growing in numbers, understanding, and organization, and the hardest fought strikes in our nation's history developed. One of the most desperate of these was the Great Homestead, Pennsylvania strike of July 1892. The strike was directed against the Carnegie Steel Company by the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers to prevent an announced wage cut. The company brought in 300 Pinkerton detective gunmen to break the strike, but the armed workers drove them out and occupied the plants. Finally, however, the strike was broken and a mortal blow was dealt to trade unionism throughout the trustified steel industry. We'll play 10 minutes.
Frick was an uncompromising foe of organized labor, determined to increase profits. Carnegie chose him to run the new concern.
Frick had smashed the unions in his coke ovens at Connellsville, and some people said he meant to do a similar job in Homestead. While negotiations were still ostensibly in progress, Frick had a tall fence built around the mill and erected searchlight platforms around the mill yard. The union men promptly nicknamed the mill Fort Frick. A group of carpenters working on the fence heard a rougher call to one of them. "Do a good job on that fence, Charlie." The carpenter replied, "Ain't it a hell of a note? Like asking a man to dig his own grave."
The great convention of the Amalgamated Association opens today. It is beyond question the most powerful independent labor organization in the world, and every movement of the manufacturers seems to aim at its destruction in the coming conflict.
Homestead's unionized workers were given an ultimatum: sign the company's contract by June 24th, or work in the mill on a non-union basis.
The eyes of the whole world of labor are at present fixed on Homestead. You are entering on a struggle for your rights. If you succeed, the labor of this great country will profit by your success. If you fail, success on their part will be all the harder to gain.
John McLucky took the floor.
The reduction of wages proposed by Mr. Frick means that we will receive from 12 to 42% less. This would mean a cessation of public improvements in Homestead, a material reduction of the prosperity of the town, and in a great many cases, individual hardship. We are asking nothing but our rights, and we will have them if it requires force to get them.
On June 24th, negotiations deadlocked. The following day, Frick wrote a letter to Robert Pinkerton, head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency.
We will want 300 guards for service at our Homestead mills as a measure of precaution against interference with our plan to start the operation of the works again on July 6, 1892.
The Pinkerton Agency was the most effective strike-breaking force in the country. By 1892, Pinkertons had used spies and armed guards to end over 70 labor disputes. So flagrant was their disregard for human life that 11 states had outlawed their employment. Working people feared and despised them. On June 28th, the Carnegie Company shut down the open hearth furnace and the armor plate mill, locking out 800 men. The next morning, the Amalgamated called a mass meeting. Most of the 3,000 who attended were not skilled workers. They didn't belong to the union, but all agreed to stand firm with the locked-out men. Soon, they would have little choice. During the meeting, the company shut the mill down, laying off the entire workforce. Within days, 600 of the foreign-born workers formed their own lodge of the Amalgamated. By 1892, Homestead had become home to an international working class. The expanding mill drew Slovaks, Poles, and other Eastern Europeans, just as it had their British, Irish, and German co-workers. Despite the anti-immigrant sentiments which prevailed in Western Pennsylvania, skilled and unskilled, union and non-union, native and foreign-born workers cast their lot together to succeed or fail as one. The Amalgamated appointed an advisory committee to direct the workmen's actions during the lockout. For their spokesman, they chose a charismatic young leader, Hugh O'Donnell.
The committee has decided to organize their forces on a truly military basis. We will be in touch with every city and hamlet in the United States, and will hear the moment a train of men for the mill leaves other cities.
Newspaper reporters and sketch artists converged on Homestead to see if the nation's largest steelmaker and its most militant labor union would come to blows.
The locked-out men are on picket duty at every possible point of entrance to the works. The country is thoroughly picketed and patrolled for 4 miles in every direction. No stranger is allowed to remain in town until his credentials have been proved satisfactory.
We do not propose that Andrew Carnegie's representatives shall bulldoze us. We have our homes in this town, our churches, our societies, and our cemeteries. We are bound to Homestead by all the ties that men hold dearest and most sacred. The Carnegie Company has imported men of all nationalities in places that are east of us, and west of us, and south of us. They never have imported a man into Homestead, and by God, they never will.
A suppressed volcano exists among the American workmen. And someday, there will be an uprising that will become history.
The Reverend J.J. McIllier was Homestead's Methodist minister.
The question is often asked, where would Homestead be without the mills? Why not ask, Where would Andrew Carnegie be without the millions he has made from the mills? Capitalists should remember that men do not sell their self-respect when they sell their labor.
Even Ivy Leaguers absorbed in the weekend's Yale-Harvard race followed the events with increasing alarm. 1892 was a presidential election year, and Homestead posed a threat to the incumbent Republican Party. The Republican platform centered around a high tariff policy, supported by both business and labor. If the dispute at Homestead could not be settled to the workers' satisfaction, the party risked losing labor's vote.
July 2nd to the New York Times. The Carnegie Steel Company gave formal notice today that the Homestead mill is to be operated as a non-union plant. The secretary said, any of our old employees may return to work, but they must make application as individuals. All who do not apply will be considered not to desire work, and their places will be filled by new men.
On the 4th of July, Frick sent a coded cable to Carnegie regarding plunge, their code word for Homestead.
Small pond pony plunge, repairing pond pony choke, watchman arrive, plunge morning, board early.
The following day, Frick sent a message to the Allegheny County Jail. He asked the sheriff to send 100 deputies to Homestead to secure the mill for non-union workers. The sheriff feared this would cost him workers' votes. But Pittsburgh's political bosses pressured him to do Frick's bidding. He responded half-heartedly, leaving for Homestead with only 12 men. When the deputies arrived, the town appeared calm and the mill undamaged. The Amalgamated volunteered men to be sworn in as deputies, arguing that the union had a strong interest in protecting the mill. The sheriff refused, knowing this was not what Frick had in mind. Under the circumstances, the advisory committee refused to be held responsible for the mill and formally disbanded. As the committee destroyed its records, the sheriff and his men retreated to Pittsburgh. Within hours, Frick would press ahead with his secret plan for the 6th of July.
With that, we'll break for our first round of questions and comments. I'd just like to say something quick. They mentioned the Amalgamated in this video. I just want to give a quick overview. The Amalgamated was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, of Iron, Tin, and Steel Workers. We'll learn a little bit more about them in the 30s later on when we get into the SWOC organizing campaign.
Yeah, I just wanted to note, on Tuesday, he said that Andrew Carnegie believed that labor's right to organize was as fundamental as the boss's right to organize. And, it's interesting here because he's obviously aware of what's going on here. He's in correspondence with Fick, so I just wanted to say that's, he gave up his principles very quickly. Not that it's surprising because it's his class interest, but...
Well, we see that with any capitalist that claims to support labor. As soon as they come to them, they're like any other capitalist. We saw that with Cenk Uygur and the Young Turks not too long ago.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Carnegie, he came from Scotland, and he actually grew up working in a factory. I think he worked in the looms, some textile industry that he used to work in. And so he came from a worker background, and I think that's kind of why he viewed labor in that way. But of course, he didn't get to where he was by being friends with labor. And it wasn't, we didn't have enough time to go over it, but there was other things that he did that were anti-union in a way. He would use the craft unions against each other, and he would exploit the weakness of craft unionism in order to justify making the entire factory non-union. There, it was touched on in the video, but that's essentially the type of way that he would go about it. He was probably closer to classical liberalism in that way, that he could see the I don't know, the Enlightenment ideals of union organizing, and he tangentially agreed with that, but of course, because of his interest as a capitalist, he had to suppress it. Can I get a volunteer to read the next section?
Section 2, the Great Steel Strike of 1919. During World War I, the Chicago I2L Group set itself the goal of the organization of the national steel industry, the toughest of all tasks confronting the labor movement. This campaign was begun on April 7, 1918, only a week after the Altshuler decision in the packing industry. The left-wingers represented the resolution on organization to the Chicago Federation of Labor, which endorsed it. William Z. Foster was elected delegate of the CFL to the AFL convention at St. Paul in June 1918, and he had the Steel Resolution adopted there. The organizing campaign began under a national organizing committee of representatives of 23 unions, with 3 million members. Samuel Gompers was chairman and Foster was organizing secretary. Later on, as the strike approached, Gompers got cold feet, resigned from the chairmanship, and put John Fitzpatrick in his place. The Great Steel Strike. Hardly had the war ended when the employers began their drive against the trade unions, but it only got really underway during the Great Steel Strike of September 1919. This offensive was in evidence at the National Industrial Conference of October 1919, called by President Wilson presumably to adjust the stormy industrial situation. At this conference, the big industrial doctors not only refused to settle the current steel strike, but they virtually declared war upon all organized labor. Labor unions are no longer necessary, as said of the arrogant Judge Gary, head of U.S. Steel, and the conference acted in this sense. The big steel strike of 367,000 workers was fought out under terroristic conditions. The whole of the steel areas was overrun with strike bearers, armed guards, police, deputy sheriffs, and troops. Pickets were arrested on site, and in the Great Monongahela River district outside of Pittsburgh, where 200,000 steelworkers were employed, not a single mass meeting of strikers was permitted during the nearly 4 months of the strike. Finally, the strike was broken and the unions completely smashed. Among the 22 killed in the strike was Mrs. Fanny Sellens, UMW organizer in the Steel Campaign, who was brutally murdered by Steel Trust gunmen at New Kensington, Pennsylvania. The need for industrial unionism. The open shop movement, with its big slogan of the American Plan, was soon raging throughout the country. All the big employers' associations, the National Association of Manufacturers, United States Chamber of Commerce, and many powerful bodies in the individual industries were in it, backing the National Open Shop Association. By the autumn of 1920, said Perlman and Taft, the country was covered with a network of open shop organizations. In New York State alone, at least 50 open shop associations were active. In In the Midwest and West, the drive was no less malignant than in the industrial East. During the decade of the war and post-war period, the working class had greatly changed. The number of workers engaged in industry was up by 31.6%. The sharp dividing line between skilled and unskilled was greatly blurred by the growth of mass production. A considerable black proletariat had grown up in the northern industries, and with immigration shut off, the speed of Americanization of the foreign-born workers had been hastened. All this made for a greater homogeneity and solidarity among the workers. The workers, coming out of the war and harassed by the rapidly rising cost of living, were in a militant mood. During 1919, over 4.1 million workers engaged in strikes, the largest number in any one year in previous American history. This worker militancy produced, among many other struggles, the notable general strikes in Seattle in February and in Winnipeg, Manitoba in August, the Boston police strike in September, the unofficial strike of 200,000 railroad shopmen, and the great coal and steel strikes in September. These strikes, while bringing certain economic concessions to the workers in each case, were all beaten to a greater or less extent by the aggressive employers, with the help of the government, the police, and the courts. The coal strike I actually don't know that word.
Peremptorily.
The coal strike was peremptorily outlawed by an injunction issued by federal Judge Anderson, who forbade the national officers of the UMW to do anything that would further the strike. John L. Lewis then called off the strike, making his well-known statement, quote, "I cannot fight the government," unquote. The miners continued to fight on, however, and eventually won livable agreements. Gompers' betrayal. These campaigns were marked with the characteristic Gompers sabotage, employer violence, and government repression. Nevertheless, the organizers managed to unite 250,000 steel workers in all the major steel centers of the country. The plan had been to force a favorable settlement through a strike in wartime, but owing to lack of funds, the campaign was slowed and the national strike of 367,000 steel workers did not come about until September 22, 1919, about 10 months after the war's end. The strike was crushed after nearly 4 months by a combination of sabotage by the Gompers machine and the wholesale strike breaking and violence by the employers and the government. Although the Great Strike was lost, the employers had to abolish the 12-hour day and 7-day week, and to introduce many improvements in wages and working conditions. The 1919 strike, by proving that the steel industry, the greatest of all trustified, open shop company unionized industries, could be organized, and paved the way for the completion of this basic task 15 years later by the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations.
With that, we'll break for our second round of questions.
In my opinion, I think that this strike is one of the most important strikes in American history. Just because it showed that even against the opposition within the labor movement, it could still be overcome. I think it showed hope. It showed the importance of rank and file organization.
Yeah, I always wondered, how did strikers last for months? 4 months, 6 months. They're on strike. How do they last? Be able to do that?
Well, they're at this period of time, and we can use the strike in Patterson as an example. They some of the skilled workers were a little bit better off, and they had a little bit of land, and a lot of people had gardens. So there was a lot of food that was being grown by the workers themselves. Sure, some of it was bought, but mostly just supplies. things that were harder to make. And so at the Patterson strike, they had the Bottle House has a garden in the back. They had a cellar. So they had a lot of preserved food. There was auxiliary organizations of the families that would help as well. It wasn't just the workers that were involved in this. It was all of their families as well. And so it was a group effort by everyone. And that's just sustaining the workers. And then on top of that, as we saw in the video of the Homestead strike, it was a military organization where they had people keeping an eye out on scabs and all of that thing. So the organization of the strikers was also key in preventing the bosses from trying to break the strike.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I've started to, over time, anytime I see Samuel Gomper show up in the scene, it always makes me kind of like, I don't know, look at things cautiously, because it seems like every time he pops up somewhere or he gets involved with something, he has always been just such a roadblock to the rank and file militancy, or in this case, I mean, he just flat out resigns and runs away. It seems to be very common throughout his whole history. He puts up this nice front of this being a labor leader, but anytime there's any militancy, he rejects it and fights against it so hard.
Talking about the Patterson strike, they had a whole network of families that were taking children of the strikers to take care of them throughout the strike.
Wow.
They had obviously they had local strike funds, and they would do fundraising. They would do food, like was said earlier. They had to be really creative. And I got a feeling that we're probably going to have to take some lessons from that in the near future.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I remember in past classes, there was like a coal miners strike, and I remember the woman played a really integral part in that strike. And the community as well really supported the workers. So those aspects are also important.
Yeah, every single strike is not just the workers themselves on the picket line. It's all of their families and involved in helping them make it possible. We can go back to the presentation.
All right, section 3, organizing methods in the steel industry. From the introduction to organizing methods in the steel industry, the methods outlined below of doing organization work in the steel industry are based upon the general principles of organization, strategy, and tactics developed in my pamphlet entitled Unionizing Steel. They embody the lessons of the 1919 strike and of other steel struggles, and they are suggested to the Steelworkers Organizing Committee for its consideration. The general principles in my pamphlet may be very briefly summarized as follows. 1, the organization work must be done by a working combination of the progressive and left-wing forces in the labor movement. It is only these elements that have the necessary vision, flexibility, and courage to go forward with such an important project as the organization of the 500,000 steelworkers in the face of the powerful opposition of the Steel Trust and its capitalist allies. As far as the right-wing reactionaries crystallized in the Executive Council of the American Federation of Labor are concerned, They will not and cannot organize the steelworkers. In 1936, even as in 1919, their attitude is one of sabotage and obstruction. 2, the organization campaign must be based upon the principles of trade union democracy. That is, every effort must be made to draw the widest possible ranks of the workers into the activities of the leading decisive committees, and also into the work of the organizers and the union generally. Only with such democracy or systematic mass participation can the great task of building the union be successfully accomplished. 3, the organization movement must be industrial and national in character. That is, A, it must include every category of workers in the steel industry, not merely a thin stratum of skilled workers at the top. And B, the drive must be carried on energetically and simultaneously in every steel center, not simply here and there spasmodically in individual mills or steel centers. 4, the campaign must develop a strong discipline among the organizers and workers in order to prevent the movement from being wrecked by company-inspired local strikes and other disruptive tendencies. The necessary discipline cannot be attained by issuing drastic orders, but must be based upon wide education work among the rank and file and the development of confidence among them in the cause and ultimate victory of the movement. 5, the organization campaign must be a fighting movement. It must realize that if the steel workers are to be organized, they can only rely upon themselves and the support they get from other workers. While every advantage should be taken of all political institutions and individuals to defend the steelworkers' civil rights and to advance their interests generally, it would be the worst folly to rely upon Roosevelt, Earl, or other capitalist politicians to adopt measures to organize the steelworkers. There is every probability that only through a great strike can the steelworkers establish their union and secure their demands, and this perspective must be constantly borne in mind. 6, although the steelworkers must not place their faith in capitalist politicians, they should utilize every means to develop working class political activity and organization in the steel areas. Especially there should be organized local labor parties in the steel towns and thus foundations laid for an eventual farmer labor party. 7, the movement must be highly self-critical. That is, there should be a constant re-examination of the organization methods used. Only in such a way can the necessary adjustments be made in tactics to fit the different situations. And only thus can the workers and organizers avoid defeat and pessimism and be given a feeling of confidence and sure success. It is a fatal mistake to try to apply blueprint methods of organization to an industry that presents so many and varied situations as steel. Flexibility in the work is a first essential, and to achieve this requires drastic self-criticism. The situation in the steel industry is now highly favorable, and if the organization work is prosecuted energetically with due regard for the mistakes and weaknesses of past strikes and struggles, it will succeed. The present campaign of the Committee for Industrial Organization, of which John L. Lewis is the head, has many advantages over 1919. The industry is increasing production. The political situation is more favorable for maintaining the civil rights of the workers to meet and organize. The workers are in a more militant mood. The right of the workers to organize is more generally recognized. The campaign is being carried on upon the basis of one industrial union instead of 24 crafts. The illusions about company unionism are less now than ever. The campaign has the solid support of a dozen powerful trade unions. There are ample funds for the organizing work. The language problem is not as severe as in earlier years. the radio now enables the message of unionism to evade employers' censorship and to be carried directly into the steelworker's home. And lastly, there is now in the field a strong Communist Party, which was not so in 1919, that is lending all its support to the success of the campaign.
That will break for another round of comments and questions.
I am assuming the pamphlet we're talking about was William Z. Foster?
Yes.
Okay. And I think we need to give a few words on William Z. Foster and John L. Lewis, especially because we have some new people here. And the other thing, this is where the Farmers Labor Party was brought up. And, you know, it'd be great if you can give us a few words on some of our efforts as far as this party goes. That's all.
Farmer labor parties that was mentioned in the pamphlet. Let me start with Foster. Foster was the national secretary of the International Trade Union Educational League at this time in 1919, and he was involved along with the AFL in trying to organize steel industry. And then fast forward to 1936, he's once again involved, but as I believe at that point it was the Trade Union Unity League, but still he is the national secretary. And now you have this committee that was put together basically at the top to try to organize steel. And Foster was one of the leaders of that. He's also, of course, who we draw a great deal of inspiration from and why this organization exists. And then John L. Lewis was the president of the Mine Workers Union, who was during the 1919 strike. I don't believe he was the president then, but the mine workers at that point were more craft union in orientation, I would say. But then as time progressed, there was the transition to industrial unionism as a necessity to combat the coal operators from trying to destroy their union. And so John L. Lewis saw the necessity for industrial unionism and why he, among other leaders within the AFL, built the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And so the farmer labor parties that was mentioned previously, at that time in 1919 was a initiative that was being supported by labor, that happened along the same time as the La Follette movement. At that time there was a very, very big third party movement tendency among the people here. And so La Follette was also a senator in the government. And so that's why he had a lot of sway. I guess the parallel would be Bernie Sanders today. If Bernie Sanders was to call for a third party. And so Tool supported it, and then Tool supported the labor parties. Does that answer what you were asking?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is a stamp out with John L. Lewis, USPS stamp, and I was just interested that he had, was able to be one of the selected stamps. I was just curious on that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned. This was the entire introduction to organizing methods in the steel industry. We're trying to narrow this uh, this pamphlet down for the class. Really decided the only way to do it was to show the introduction, which gave a little bit of an outline of each section. I recommend everybody getting that, finding a copy of it. It could be found anywhere, pretty much anywhere on the internet. There's multiple PDFs floating around of it. We're also going to try to republish it in the next year or so. But this is a very important pamphlet. It is essentially the manual used for successful organizing campaigns throughout the country. Most recently, the Amazon Labor Union campaign here in Staten Island, JFK, they use this pamphlet in their organizing. So it's just something to keep an eye on, and it's this really, really digging into this work will help us all grow as organizers. Thank you.
And I don't think I didn't make a distinction before when I was explaining this. There was essentially two farmer labor parties that was being built. There was the one in the 20s and then the one in the 30s. There was a resurgence in the call for this third party, and it had a lot of momentum behind it. And I guess the only thing I'll say, because this is getting off track, but the Woody Guthrie actually made a song about the Farmer Labor Party, if you want to look it up. Okay, so we'll go back to the presentation.
Section 4, SWOC Organizing. Steelworkers Organizing Committee. On June 12th, CIO President John L. Lewis announced the formation of SWOC, a unique institutional creation. The committee would be a separate entity covered broadly by the CIO umbrella, but with its own governing board consisting of members appointed in effect by Lewis and representing the unions contributing to it. The committee's initial funding came almost entirely from the UMW. SWOC differed from all previous organizations in mass production industries. Unlike earlier radical industrial unions, it endorsed standard collective bargaining goals. At the same time, unlike the AFL, it appealed directly to the steelworkers, recognizing that mass recruitment and shop floor power alone could bring Big Steel to the bargaining table. It had the forceful backing of the UMW and its now bulging treasury, ensuring a ready supply of cash, experienced organizers, and most importantly, the vigorous support of the nation's most powerful and energetic labor leader. Unlike the National Committee for Organizing Iron and Steel Workers of 1919 to 20, SWOC could ignore crippling AFL jurisdictional regulations. It would function as a centralized, authoritative body, dispatching organizers, dispensing money, generating publicity, and recruiting workers directly into its ranks. SWOC's first victory. On the heels of the successful UAW sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, the United States Steel Corporation, throughout its history a fierce opponent of organized labor, signed a preliminary agreement recognizing the Steelworkers Organizing Committee as a legitimate bargaining agent for employees who were members of that organization on March 2nd, 1937. The two parties signed a formal contract on March 17th. These agreements were the culmination of secret talks between Congress of Industrial Organizations President John L. Lewis and U.S. Steel Chairman Myron Taylor. The agreement was the first victory for SWOC in its efforts to represent the entire steel industry. That violence was not used to prevent unionization made the victory even more surprising. NLRB versus Jones and Lawland Steel Corp. In May 1937, workers at Jones and Lawland Steel Corp issued an ultimatum. agree to a contract similar to the U.S. Steel one by an appointed date, they would walk out. Members at two locals voted to strike. With no contract in place, some 25,000 workers launched a strike the night of May 12th. Pickets fanned out in Hazelwood, the South Side, and Aliquippa, totally shutting the plants, with the exception of a handful of maintenance workers allowed in under agreements with SWOC. The Post-Gazette reported from Pittsburgh, the pickets just massed in tight little crowds, completely blocking entrances to the mills, and waited for someone to appear and try to enter. No one did, or at least only one or two hardy souls, and they didn't have any clear idea why they wanted to get in. Things were rougher in Aliquippa. The town, long dominated by Jones and Lawlin, set its police force against the pickets, with officers releasing tear gas amid fistfights. A salary worker in his 60s tried to get through the line. Workers set upon him, exchanging blows. A woman in her 40s, the mother and wife of strikers, allegedly struck a police chief with her umbrella and suffered a club wound in response. SWOC head Philip Murray accused steel producers of forming an unholy alliance, stocking implements of industrial warfare against the union. He was right. The so-called little steel companies had brought astounding amounts of crowd control gas and stockpiled guns in their facilities, as a congressional investigation would find. Clashes with police and would-be strikebreakers made for shocking photographs. In Aliquippa, workers pushed a bus through the plant gates. On the south side, curious school children mingled with strikers as showers of sandwiches and hard-boiled eggs fell from the lunchboxes torn from scabs' hands. Even as state and federal mediators worked toward a solution, state officials moved in with force. The governor rushed in from Harrisburg, having already dispatched state police to Aliquippa. Liquor sales were suspended in the strike-hit neighborhoods, and members of the new independent union, the United Iron and Steel Workers, threatened to reopen the plants by force. One member made his opinion clear. Do you want a low class of ignorant foreigners running us? I'm ready now to go down and give my life to clear the paths to that plant. They wouldn't get the chance. The next day, Jones and Lawlin agreed to SWOC's demand. If workers voted to join the union, it would represent all eligible members. All the strikers would return to their jobs without discrimination. Workers cheered in the streets as news spread that the strike was off. It had lasted about 36 hours. The National Labor Relations Board posted announcements in English, Italian, Polish, and Serbian, and within a week, thousands of Jones and Lawlin workers were voting at dozens of sites at the company's mill complexes. By May 21st, the vote was in. Of more than 24,400 votes cast, over 17,000 were for the union, a greater than 2-to-1 majority. CIO leaders hailed the result. Murray said universal collective throughout the steel industry wasn't far off. Jones and Lawlin had fired 10 employees at its plant in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, after they moved to unionize. They were charged with discriminating against workers who wanted to join SWOC. The NLRB ruled against the company and ordered that the workers be rehired and given back pay, but Jones and Lawlin refused to comply on the grounds that the Wagner Act, which had established the NLRB, was unconstitutional. Citing Supreme Court precedent, lower courts agreed. In a 5-4 decision, Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes upheld the constitutionality of the Wagner Act, holding that Congress could regulate economic activities that were intrastate in character when separately considered, if they held such a close and substantial relation to interstate commerce that their control is essential or appropriate to protect that commerce from burdens and obstructions. In his dissent, Associate Justice James Clark McReynolds argued that Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce should be limited to cases in which a violation is direct and material. The next phase of SWOC's campaign would be far more violent. In late May, the union struck 4 little steel firms, mostly outside the Pittsburgh area, for the same recognition. They fought back brutally, and many would die before the union's defeat.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1937. That was the day the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, or SWOC, called a nationwide strike against 3 of the 4 little steel companies, Republic, Inland, and Youngstown Sheet and Tube. The drive to organize Little Steel came on the heels of an historic agreement with U.S. Steel and J&L earlier in the year. In his book, The Last Great Strike, legal scholar Ahmed White points out that SWOC leaders established a 3-pronged strategy in their organizing efforts: to break down racial and ethnic diversities among workers, to use the Wagner Act and newly formed NLRB to their advantage whenever possible, and to take over company unions where they existed. They hoped Little Steel would follow earlier precedent, but mill owners wouldn't budge on union recognition. Firing of organizers intensified and lockouts began. Sheriff's departments began the swearing in of deputies. Republic and Youngstown Sheet and Tube started shipping and stockpiling munitions, including machine guns and tear gas, to mills throughout the Midwest and Northeast. Scattered walkouts and wildcats began throughout the latter part of May as SWOC continued to demand recognition and first contracts. And on this day, SWOC delegates from the Little Steel locals met in a Youngstown War Council to demand a strike. The strike began late that evening with the shift change at 11 p.m. The mills were shut down tight. Pitched battles between strikers, scabs, and police continued throughout the summer, with hundreds arrested. Anti-union violence would explode with the Memorial Day massacre in South Chicago and the Women's Massacre in Youngstown the following month. After 5 months, the strike collapsed. It would take until 1942 before recognition was finally won. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the... I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1937. That was the day known as among the darkest days for labor, the Memorial Day Massacre. For days, strikers had suffered arrests and severe beatings at the hands of Chicago police, who physically prevented them from establishing picket lines at South Chicago's Republic Steel. Joined by supporters from practically all walks of life, strikers decided late in the afternoon to march to the gates, determined to picket. For Michael Dennis, author of The Memorial Day Massacre and the Movement for Industrial Democracy, Southeast Chicago became a crucible in which a wide spectrum of social and political alternatives became possible. The Little Steel strike was propelled by the realization that workers lived in a country dedicated to democratic freedom, but worked under conditions of near autocracy. Men, women, and children, black, white, and Mexican workers all chanted CIO, CIO as they marched down Green Bay Avenue. The Chicago police waited for them, armed with revolvers, nightsticks, and blackjacks. Strikers defended their right to picket as police once again formed a solid line, preventing their passage. The police soon launched tear gas canisters and began firing into the crowd. The picketers turned away in a futile attempt to escape the staggering brutality. When the dust settled, 10 were killed, 30 more shot, 28 others hospitalized, with 8 suffering permanent disability and another 20 to 30 injured. Virtually all those shot had wounds in the back or side. Michael Dennis notes the massacre cast the die for the strike. Collaboration between municipal officials, corporate leaders, and the military in suppressing the strike would go uncontested by federal authorities and cheered by middle-class opinion. The campaign to organize Little Steel had suffered a crushing blow.
The Little Steel Strike. The Little Steel Strike was led by SWOC against a number of smaller steel-producing companies, principally Republic Steel, Inland Steel, and Youngstown Steel and Tube Company. The strike affected a total of 30 different mills belonging to the three companies which employed 80,000 workers. The strike was one of the most violent labor disputes of the 1930s. The strike is characterized as one of the most violent strikes of the 1930s, with thousands of strikers arrested, 300 injured, and 18 dead. The little steel companies eventually defeated the strike, which lasted just over 5 months' time. However, groundwork for the unionization of the little steel industry was set, and the goal to unionize little steel occurred 5 years later, in 1942, as World War II began to ramp up.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1937. That was the day SWOC leader Philip Murray beat back reports that the Little Steel strike had collapsed. Even as the steel companies were championing that the strike had been broken, Murray insisted that of the 90,000 workers involved, only 20,000 had returned to work in the mills that stretched across 7 states. He added they were mostly supervisors and foremen and not production workers. Murray leveled charges against Ohio Governor Martin Davey that the Ohio National Guard was being used as company police to smash the strike. Strike leaders added that the companies were staging dummy back-to-work parades. In fact, Labor Secretary Perkins had announced that it was the government's effort at mediation that had collapsed. But the steel magnates were on the offensive and had the backing of local politicians and police. George Mike, a Union man and disabled veteran, was the latest casualty in the anti-labor war. He was killed the day before at Maltrup Steel in Beaver Falls, Ohio, as picketers clashed with deputy sheriffs. In Indiana, police rushed to plant gates at Inland Steel to guard against new battles as 20,000 strikers prepared for the imminent forced reopenings of Inland Steel and Youngstown Sheet and Tube there. Both mills remained closed for weeks. In Warren, Ohio, police issued a warrant for CIO strike leader Gus Hall and 2 other strike leaders on charges that he was the brains behind a terrorist plot to blow up strike-bound steel mills. And at Bethlehem's Cambria Works in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 2 separate dynamitings destroyed main water supplies, causing an immediate end to an attempted back-to-work movement there. The strike was far from over. Labor History in 2.
With so many of the unionists on strike being killed, beaten, and arrested, the protesters quickly lost morale and motivation to continue with the strike. Protesters knew that even on a day that seemed quiet, violence could explode at any minute over the most insignificant cause, and many could no longer risk their lives for the cause of the SWOC. As police and the National Guard began enforcing court orders to vacate, the weakened and demoralized picket lines began to crumble, and after 5 months, the Little Steel strike finally came to an end. However, the failure of the strike was not solely from violence, well-organized public relations, or the failing morale of the strikers. Right before the Little Steel strike began, the economy had slipped back into a slight depression, causing less demand for steel. Fewer employees were needed to satisfy the decreased demand. The SWOC was not able to use lost profits as a bargaining tool. It was aggressive strike-breaking tactics from Little Steel, lack of organization from SWOC, and demoralized unionists that made the strike end by the end of the summer of 1937, with the companies victorious.
And with that, I think we'll have just a final round of questions.
All right, you mentioned that SWOC, SWOC, was able to get funding from UMW, and that's United Mine Workers, right?
Correct.
Right, and it said that they were pretty flush. Just on that statement alone, can you explain what it was between SWOC and UMW?
Like why they were working together?
Correct, yeah.
So this was during the period of the Congress of Industrial Organization. So it was involved in that. So that's why the mine workers were helping, because the AFL was refusing to organize the unorganized. in the mass production industries.
Cool. All right, cool.
Can I get to that? SWOC was the one campaign within the Committee for Industrial Organizations, later the Congress for Industrial Organizations, that was a top-down led organization. SWOC was created by John L. Lewis and the United Mine Workers to counteract the Amalgamated Association and essentially build within the Amalgamated Association to organize the steelworkers on industrial grounds. That's why it was so flush with cash. And something that was noted, you know, that first contract with U.S. Steel, you know, a large reason that happened without any violence was because of the success of the Flint sit-down strike.
Want to remind everybody, in case there's anybody new today, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee was a small group of volunteers, of people who devoted their life to doing this. And one of them was none other than Gus Hall, who later became the General Secretary of the Communist Party USA. I want to mention that when I was in the old Communist Party in 1970, I think it was in 1980, the early 80s, the Steelworkers Union gave Gus Hall an award. Very interesting. They gave him an award for being one of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee original people.
I would add one of the reasons why SWOC was so important to the UMW was because of the relationship between the steel producers and the coal companies as well. They had a pretty immediate interest to organize that in order to maintain their standards in the coal industries.
One last question. When I was listening to the humongous power that our U.S. steel industry had, I wonder if that is why so much of it became a candidate for offshoring, so that we do not have the huge steel industry we have now, because it was offshored by the companies, so they didn't have problem as far as unions go. Just, I was wondering, that was all.
I would say that was contributed to it for sure. All right, so we'll go back to the presentation. So the Harry Bridges School of Labor is obviously by Lowell, and you can find us on Twitter at Lowell_US, Instagram at Lowell.US, Facebook at LaborUnited.Lowell, and YouTube at Labor United. Our website is Lowell.US, and then our publication Labor Today is labortoday.lowell.us. Next month's class is going to take place on Wednesday, December 4th, and then again on Saturday, December 7th. And it's going to be actually a presentation from Adam, who is the national organizer for Public Rail Now, which is ran by the Railroad Workers United. And we'll end with Solidarity Forever.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.